So, today we are going to document the assembly process for the FDM 3D printed Velox Armoured Assault Vehicle kit, which is available now for free on MakerWorld. The link is in the description. First, you will need to print everything, of course. There are 6 plates, each containing specific components to help organize and reduce printing risks. You can, of course, combine plates if you feel confident, but I would recommend just taking it slowly and individually. Once printed, you will have a mess of parts, and to assemble these you will only need superglue and possibly a hobby knife for any cleanup. But this kit is designed to print cleanly with no supports, so cleanup is likely going to be very minimal. So let's get started. First we have plate 1, which contains the parts for the inner hull which makes the basic frame for the whole vehicle. We have the 2 side panels which also mount the wheels, the top panel which holds the turret and a driver's cupola, the rear plate which includes the engine and rear exhausts, the front top and bottom plates, the bucket for the driver's cupola, and the base plate with wheel mounting ports. We'll start with the base plate and one of the side plates. They slot together easily, as you can see by the projections and recessions along the edges of each part. There is only one side each piece will connect on, as if it is the wrong side, it simply will not fit. Running a few beads of superglue along the seam should be enough, because FDM seems to bond very strongly once the glue has set. A little pressure to hold the joint and a quick check that the angle hits 90 degrees, and that is done. So repeat the process with the other side piece and you'll have the basis of the hull bottom complete. From here on, everything has slots and anchors to guide their positions. Next, the rear plate. Again, there is only one way it will fit correctly, so you can test before gluing and then apply a small amount of glue along the edges. Add a little pressure to the pieces and that's done. Onto the front, starting with the bottom plate, which again should be obvious on how it fits. Then we can add the front top plate, but it will be more convenient to add the actual top plate first, since that provides more anchor points for the front plate. A few lines of glue using the rear plate to align the top plate and it should slot into place. Depending on any slight warping during the printing process, you may get slight gaps at some of the seams, but these will be covered later, so that's not a problem. Then finally we can slide the front top plate into position using the top plate as a guide, and the whole inner hull is now solid and complete. There is also the driver's cupola bucket which can be glued in place or left loose for now. Onto plate 2, which contains the external armor pieces that fit onto the front and sides of the hull we built in the previous step. We'll start with the front armor plates. The top one simply fits around the inner hull, aligning with the edges and the driver's window. The bottom piece sits on the bottom half and slots into the little arms protruding from the side panels. The side armor sits on the side, but we'll look at that later. A small amount of glue on the flat surface should be enough to bond the pieces, but make sure you have the bottom piece correctly rotated. It should protrude slightly at the top to give the top piece something to sit against, and the bottom should continue the angle across the bottom. Again, there may be slight gaps or lines where the different pieces come together, but this will help enhance the look of heavy slabs of armor, and most of it will be covered anyway. So now we can place the top armor in its place. A small amount of glue and a gentle alignment should be all you need here. And now the front is finished. Onto the side armor. You can see a few protruding ledges from the sides of the hull. This is where the side armor will sit on top of. It is important to note as well that the edges of the side armor will protrude slightly beyond the end of the sides, so avoid placing glue at these edges. Then, with a bit of glue on the larger chunks, simply slip the side armor over the ledges where it should fit comfortably, and then do the same for the other side. Now the armor is complete and the main hull is basically finished. It is likely I will design some variant pieces to add to this, since the hull is now quite modular. Different turrets, maybe hover engines, we could do all sorts of things. Onto the turret. The main section of the turret holds most of the other pieces. First, we will address the central column which sits beneath the main section and links it to the main hull. You will see in the base of the main section a partially circular cutout. This is where the central column slots in two, with the large and smaller teeth aligning with the same sized projections. You may notice a small circle marker in the inside of the central column. This is so that you can center and drill a small hole for a magnet if you wanted to magnetize or pin the turret and hull connection. A small amount of glue on the lower portions of the central column should be enough to bind it to the main section with a little pressure to align everything properly. Next we have the cradle for the main gun mount, which will slide into the opening at the front of the turret. At the moment there is nothing to hold or position it, so we will move elsewhere first. The two halves of the main gun mount simply stick together, trying to ensure the front shield lines up smoothly. Then this assembly slots into the cradle, but we will first add the top of the turret so that everything has other parts to lock positions. You might notice that the top of the turret is a bit loose, with nothing to help anchor the positions. This is where the commander's cupola bucket comes into play. The cylinder can slide into the top ring, which then lets it pass through and into the receiving hole in the main section. This lets the top of the turret anchor itself so that you only need to rotate to align everything. So a line of glue around the outside surface and a small amount on the cupola support, a bit of guiding, and the main turret is almost complete. Now we can use the top section to block excess movement of the gun's cradle, using a bit of glue to stick it in place. Then we can slip the gun mount into the cradle and either glue that or leave it slightly loose. Finally, we have the top panel, which sits above the whole gun mount and hides the assembly while locking things in place. If you think you will want to remove the gun mount for access later, it is worth either not gluing this panel or only gluing it slightly. Superglue binds very strongly to FDM filament, so a tiny drop is probably more than enough. And with that, and slipping the cupola bucket back into its opening, the turret is complete. On to plate 4, the wheel assemblies. It is worth noting that the hub caps on the right are actually from plate 5, but I've put them here as they are wheel components. So, looking at the sides of the hull we assembled before, you can see 3 holes on either side. This is where the wheel assemblies will mount. The first part will be the suspension details, which both reinforce the cylinder for the axles to slot into and provide extra details to look good. Each suspension piece fits over the hole and round area, and slots beneath the small wedge on the side of the hull. Since the axle columns will fit in here, we can use them to make sure each piece is aligned, but it's worth avoiding putting glue too close to that area, as the axle might get stuck. So repeat this for all 6 of the mounts and it'll be completed. Next, the wheels themselves. Each wheel assembly has a tyre in 2 halves. Each half of the tyres has a specific direction of their tread patterns. They should be arranged so that the tyre forms a chevron style pattern rather than a diagonal line. Next we have the inner wheel hub, which sits snugly on the inside of each tyre. Each wheel also has its own axle. One wheel is an extra added as a spare if you decide to use it later. Each wheel also has an outer hub cap, which, as we said before, is actually from plate 5. So since each wheel is stacked on top of the axle, like the suspension, we can use these axles to help align the wheel while gluing it together. A few small spreads of glue should be enough to bind well and give a little adjustment allowance if needed. And again, avoid letting glue sit too close to the center hole, as it might stick to the axle. Being slow is useful here, so we can align the tire treads properly. Depending on the pattern you want, you can either create a staggered or chevron style tread. Here I have used a staggered stance since it creates the appearance of more detail. Then just repeat the process for the rest. At this stage there is no need for specific alignment except that the treads themselves align. Now that we have solid, chunky tires, we can add the inner hubs. The circular perimeter of the tire should let them align themselves cleanly, but you could use the axle for assistance if you wanted to. Again, small amounts of glue and try to avoid the center hole. Here we have to be more precise with alignment. 3 wheels should align with each other for each side of the vehicle, with the inner hub facing inside and the angle of the treads pointing forwards rather than back. Now we can add the axle end caps that serve only to add extra detail. It's a simple case of glue and visual alignment of the 2 circles, but it's not the end of the world if they are not perfectly aligned, since that gives a greater sense of them being real pieces of metal bolted together. With everything glued together, each wheel can receive each axle, and they are finished. Now quickly we can address the spare tyre, which fits together exactly the same, except its axle is slightly shorter. Plate 5 contains more detailed components. While I have suggested using a 0.2mm nozzle to print this, other printers have printed it well with 0.4mm, so you may not lose much at all from doing so. On this plate we have 4 doors which will sit on the back of the side armour. 2 are alternatives for if you decide to mount a spare tyre on the rear. Then we have the cover hatches for the cupolas and the inner details for them. The side skirts that sit at the edges of the side armour, some optic devices to decorate the turret, some exhaust boxes for the side armour, hatches, a rear storage box, and the bin for the back of the turret. We'll start with the rear doors. They sit on the back of the side armour pieces, using the small ledge at the bottom to align them. If you want to add a spare tyre for detail, then the piece with a circular cutout will support it, and can be added instead of the regular door. Next, some access hatches which sit on the sides of the side armour, with their hinges locking in between the 2 protrusions found there. Again, a tiny amount of glue is probably more than enough here. And then another hatch, this time positioned on the top of the hull. Now onto the side skirts. These have a distinctive shape that will only allow them to slot into their correct side armour pieces. Small amounts of glue at critical positions will be enough to bond these pieces. Next, the rear storage box which sits above the engine at the rear. You will see 2 small rails on the hull and 2 small slots on the bin. These slip together just as you would expect. Onto the side exhausts, and you will see that if we have the exhaust to the rear, only 1 box can fit on the correct side, so it should be self-evident which goes where. Now for the turret. First we have the commander's cupola lids and their inner details. If you have no intentions of leaving these open, you can discard the inner pieces. But if you do, or may decide to open them, you can use the inner pieces to add a bit of extra detail rather than a simple flat surface on the inside. The inner piece should be positioned so that the interior of the viewport sits at the front and the lever handle sits to the rear of the hatch by the hinges. Then you can glue the whole top piece at the hinges, with extra glue around the rim if you want them to be closed. Next, the turret bin. The bin sits against the rear of the turret, latched over the edge and onto the small ledges and brackets. The base also locks into place by its own protrusions, which slip inside the outside of the main bin. Once that is glued into place, the bin assembly will sit nicely onto the rear of the turret, with only a small bit of glue needed on the thinner walls. The lid for this bin should slot against the hinges on the turret. The bin can either be left open or shut. Next, we can add the optic details to the turret. The triangular panel fits inside the housing on the side, and the cylinder should sit on top of the nub on the top. You may need to adjust the diameter on the underside of the cylinder depending on how it printed. With the details done, we can quickly add the wheel assemblies, which is simply a case of pressing the axles of each side's 3 wheels into the housing sockets on the hull sides. As mentioned before, there are small cylinders marked in the center of the turret's central column and the receiving hole, if you decide to magnetize or add pins to these joints. Otherwise, the turret sits simply inside the socket, able to rotate 360 degrees unless you glue it down. Finally, we are at plate 6, where the weapons sit. Various weapon types are provided, with the main weapons each accepting any of these secondary weapons. The cannon is the only weapon that needs assembly, since I was not confident in its thin height printing reliably. The muzzle and the main barrel slot together over the nub, with the protrusions on the top of each aligning for correct positions. One issue you may run into when printing is possible layer sagging on the inside of the muzzle. This is a very easy fix, since it is usually only a single piece of filament per hole and you can just use a knife to cut it out. After this, combining primary and secondary weapons is just a case of slotting the cylinder inside the hole on the primary base. You could swap these as you go, or print extras to have various combos ready to go quickly. And then the weapons themselves simply fit inside the hole provided on the front of the gun mount. This can sit loosely, or you can glue it or magnetize it. Here I am simply going to hold it in place with white tack. And that's it. The Velox is complete. This Velox model is available for free on MakerWorld, with the link in the description. I will be releasing many more models to print in the future, specifically focusing on FDM technology for now. I'm thinking about starting a Patreon to provide more focused access for anybody who is interested, so if you have any thoughts on that, please let me know in the comments. But if you want closer contact, then check out the Discord linked in the description and comments, and I'll see you next time.